The dust was the first thing and the last. It was a covenant between the cracked earth and the searing sky, a fine, ochre powder that lived in the wind and settled in the soul. It coated the spines of the skeletal yucca, filled the lines on a man's face, and gathered in the corners of a home where laughter had died. The wind was its accomplice, a low, mournful singer that knew only one song, a dirge for all things green and soft. It scraped against the weathered planks of the lone homestead, a constant, rasping reminder of absence. This was the world Elias inhabited, a kingdom of silence and memory, where the sun did not warm but judged, casting long, accusing shadows that stretched like graves across the plains. His ranch was a monument to what was lost. The fence sagged, a tired spine giving way. The water trough was a basin of cracked mud. And in the house, beside the cold hearth, stood a small, empty chair, its wood worn smooth by a life cut short, and beside that, a rocking chair that no longer rocked, forever stilled on the day he had buried his wife, Sarah, beside their son. Grief was not an event for Elias, it was the atmosphere. It was the air he breathed, the grit in his bread, the hollow echo in his own footsteps. He moved through his days with the deliberate, heavy grace of a man carrying an invisible weight, his face a mask of stoic endurance carved from sun-beaten leather. The words had dried up in him long ago, leaving only a vast, arid silence where a heart once was. He made the ride to town only when necessity clawed at him, a bi-weekly pilgrimage into a world of noise and judgment he no longer understood. The town of redemption was a bitter irony, a place of small people with big certainties. They saw him and saw only a ghost, a man haunted by a tragedy they whispered about but never dared mention to his face. They saw his silence as a sickness, his solitude as a sin. He bought his flour and salt, his face impassive, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond their prying gazes. He would nod, a short, sharp dip of his head, the only currency of communication he was willing to spend. On this day, the sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the baked earth. The ride back was a slow march through a shimmering haze of heat. It was then that he saw it, a stain against the pale ribbon of the road, a heap of discarded cloth and humanity. He reined in his horse, the animal snorting, sensing the wrongness in the air. He dismounted, his boot sinking into the thick dust. It was a girl. Or what was left of one. Her dress was torn and filthy, her hair a tangled mat of dirt and dried blood. One arm was flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Her eyes were closed, her breathing a shallow, ragged flutter. But it was her legs that held his gaze, twisted at angles that nature never intended, the sharp, white gleam of bone piercing the skin of her shin. She was a broken doll, tossed from a callous hand, left for the sun and the coyotes. Around her, the dust had already begun its patient work of burial. He knelt, the leather of his chaps groaning. He saw the faint purple bruises blooming on her cheek, the shape of a man's hand. He felt something stir in the barren wasteland of his chest, a feeling so old he barely recognized it, a dull, aching rage. He looked up and down the empty road, at the vast, indifferent sky. There was no one. Nothing but him, and this broken thing. He could ride on. He could leave her to the dust. It was the way of this land. The weak were consumed. But he looked at her face, young and brutalized, and saw a reflection of his own shattered world. He couldn't fix what was broken in him, but here was a ruin he might just be able to shore up. With a gentleness his hands had almost forgotten, he gathered her up. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones and pain. She let out a soft, animal whimper, the only sound she made. As he lifted her onto his horse, the dust swirled around them, as if trying to reclaim her, but for the first time in years, Elias stood against it. He mounted behind her, holding her steady, and turned his horse not towards the judging eyes of redemption, but towards the quiet solitude of his broken home. He carried her into the house, the scent of dust and blood filling the stale air. The two empty chairs watched him, silent witnesses to this intrusion. He laid her on his own bed, the one he hadn't shared since Sarah's last breath. The girl, Ilara, though he did not know her name, remained unconscious, a small, fragile vessel adrift on a sea of pain. He worked with a grim, focused precision born of long acquaintance with the harsh realities of life and death. he fetched the splintered boards he kept for mending fences, tore strips from one of Sarah's old linens, and boiled water over the fire. Setting the bones was a brutal act of mercy. He gripped her ankle, his large, calloused hand surprisingly steady. As he pulled, a raw, guttural scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the silent house. Her eyes flew open, wide with terror and confusion, and she tried to fight, to pull away, but he held her firm. "Easy now," he murmured, the words rusty and rough in his throat. "Easy." It has to be done. She didn't understand the words, only the firm, unrelenting pressure and the searing fire in her legs. He worked quickly, binding the splints tightly, his movements economical and sure. When he was finished, she had fallen back into a restless, whimpering sleep, her face pale and slick with sweat. He wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth. For the next 3 days, she drifted in and out of a fevered haze. Elias sat in a wooden chair beside the bed, a sentinel in the gloom. He spooned thin broth between her lips when she was lucid, cleaned the wounds with carbolic soap, and kept the fire fed. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. His actions were his language. In the long hours of the night, lit only by the flickering firelight, he would sometimes speak to the shadows, his voice a low whisper. "She's just a girl, Sarah," he'd say to the empty rocking chair. "Broken." Someone just threw her away. The girl, in her fevered state, would sometimes stir at the sound of his voice, her eyelids fluttering. She was listening, not to the words, but to the tone, a soft, aching grief that she recognized in her own bones. Slowly, the fever broke. One morning, he entered the room to find her awake, her eyes clear and watchful. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a deep, primal fear. She flinched as he approached, pulling the blanket up to her chin. He stopped, holding up his hands to show they were empty. He set a bowl of stew on the bedside table and retreated to the other side of the room, turning his back to give her space. He busied himself cleaning a rifle, the rhythmic click-clack of the mechanism the only sound. He felt her gaze on his back, studying him, weighing him. This became their ritual. He would bring her food, tend to her needs, and then grant her the dignity of his absence, allowing her to exist without the pressure of his presence. He never asked her what happened. The story was written on her body, in the shattered bones and the haunted landscape of her eyes. He knew the kind of man who could do that to his own kin. He'd seen it in the dark corners of the world, a cruelty that festered behind closed doors, often in the name of God or honor. Weeks bled into one another. The raw edges of her pain began to dull. He built her a set of crutches from scavenged wood, sanding them smooth so they wouldn't splinter her hands. The first time she tried to stand, she collapsed, a strangled sob escaping her lips. He didn't rush to her. He just stood in the doorway and said, again his voice was not unkind, but it was unyielding. It was the voice of the prairie itself, which demanded resilience or death. She tried again. And again. Until finally, she was standing, leaning heavily on the crutches, her body trembling with effort. A silent, grim triumph passed between them. She began to move around the small cabin, a ghost learning to walk again. She watched him, his every move a lesson in survival. She saw the way he mended a harness, the patience in his hands. She saw the way he spoke to his horse, a low, gentle rumble. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes linger on the 2 empty chairs, a shadow passing over his face so profound it seemed to steal the light from the room. She understood his silence, for she had one of her own. Her voice was not gone, but caged, trapped behind a wall of trauma. She had no words for what her father had done, for the betrayal that had broken more than just her bones. In the quiet companionship of this broken man, she found a strange sort of peace. The silence between them was not empty, it was a shared space, a sanctuary where their respective pains could coexist without question or judgment. Her healing was a slow dawn. The splints came off, revealing legs scarred and thin, but whole. She would walk with a limp for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder etched into her gait. The limp was a map of her past, and she learned to navigate her world with it. She started to contribute, her movements quiet and deliberate. She would mend his torn shirts with neat, tiny stitches. She would sweep the floor, her motions rhythmic and steady. She learned to cook, leaving a hot meal on the table for him when he came in from the fields, exhausted and covered in dust. They rarely spoke. A nod. A shared glance. The passing of a plate. Their bond was forged in the spaces between words, in the language of shared tasks and mutual respect. He had given her sanctuary, she was slowly breathing life back into the hollow shell of his home. But the world outside their small island of quiet was not so peaceful. A lone rider, a ranch hand from a neighboring spread, had spotted her one day, a fleeting glimpse of a girl with a limp hanging laundry on the line. The sighting was a spark in the dry tinder of town gossip. The story grew with each telling, twisted into something ugly and salacious. The haunted widower, Elias, had taken in a girl. A young girl. Alone. The whispers slithered through the general store, called in the pews of the church, and found their way to the ears of Preacher Theron. The preacher was a man whose piety was a club he used to beat the world into a shape he approved of. He saw sin everywhere, especially in the lives of those who did not seek his counsel. He, along with the town sheriff, a man named Brody whose spine was as flexible as his morals, decided to pay Elias a visit. They rode up to the ranch one afternoon, their horses kicking up clouds of self-righteous dust. Elias saw them coming and met them on the porch, his body a silent barrier to the home he now protected. Ilara watched from the shadows of the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Elias, the preacher began, his voice oozing a false, syrupy concern. We've come out of Christian duty. Sheriff Brody shifted his weight, avoiding Elias's gaze. Folks are talking, Elias. Saying you're keeping the girl out here. A young girl. Elias's face was stone. He said nothing. It's not proper, the preacher continued, his voice hardening. A man like you, in your state, alone with a child of her age. People are drawing conclusions. It's an arrangement that invites sin. Elias's eyes, cold and dark as a winter river, finally met the preacher's. She needed help. The simplicity of the statement seemed to infuriate the preacher. What kind of help? What happened to her? Who is she? He gestured toward the house. Let us speak to her. We need to ensure she is safe. A flicker of something dangerous ignited in Elias's eyes. She is safe. The words were quiet, but they held the weight of an anvil. Safer than she'd be with you. Safer than she'd be in your town. Now see here, the sheriff blustered, finding a sliver of courage. This ain't right. We have a responsibility. Your responsibility, Elias said, his voice dropping lower, each word a carefully placed stone, is to ride off my land. Now the preacher's face flushed with anger. You are a fallen man, Elias. Hiding out here with your grief and your secrets. The Lord's light cannot reach you in this darkness you've built. We will not let you drag this innocent girl down with you. They left, but their threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was tense, charged with the impending storm. Ilara looked at him, her eyes wide with the old fear. He met her gaze across the small room, and for the first time, he offered her a small, tight smile. It was a promise. He would not let the world break her again. The following Sunday, the storm broke. Preacher Theron, from his pulpit, delivered a sermon of fire and fury, painting Elias as a corrupted soul and Ilara as a lamb in the clutches of a wolf. He spoke of moral decay, of the town's duty to act where the law was blind. He stirred their fear and their prejudice into a righteous froth. After the service, a small, grim-faced crowd gathered. It was not a lynch mob with ropes and torches, but something more insidious, a posse of decency, armed with the unshakable conviction that they were doing God's work. They climbed into wagons and rode out towards the ranch, the preacher and the sheriff at their head. And with them, trailing at the back like a broken shadow, was Ilara's father, a man named Silas, his face a pasty mask of shame and weakness, dragged along as the supposed injured party. Elias was waiting on the porch, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. It wasn't pointed at anyone, but its presence was a clear, cold statement. Ilara stood in the doorway behind him, her hands gripping the frame, her knuckles white. she saw her father, and a shudder racked her body. The crowd stopped a short distance away. "Elias," the preacher called out, his voice booming across the dusty yard. "There is no need for violence. We have come for the girl. We will see her placed in a good, Christian home." Elias's eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, fearful, angry, and pitifully certain. He looked past them all and fixed his gaze on Silas. "You," Elias said, his voice carrying with unnatural clarity. "You came back." Silas flinched, unable to meet his eyes. "She's my daughter," he mumbled to the ground. "She needs to be with family." "You broke her legs," Elias stated, not as a question, but as a judgment delivered from on high. "You broke her legs and threw her on the road to die." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. They had heard whispers, but to hear it stated so plainly, so brutally, was another thing entirely. The preacher's face tightened. He was disciplining a wayward child. He has repented. His moment of anger. "It is a family matter, this," Elias said, gesturing with the barrel of the shotgun to Elara, who stood pale but resolute behind him. "Is my family now." He took a step forward, his presence seeming to grow, to fill the space between the porch and the posse. "You talk of sin," he said, his voice low and resonant, burning with a fire they had never seen in him. "You stand there wrapped in your Sunday clothes, whispering about decency. But you know nothing of it. You see a man's grief and call it darkness. You see a girl's pain and call it an opportunity for salvation. Your salvation. Not hers." He looked directly at Elara, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. Then he turned back to the crowd, his voice hardening once more. "You want to take her from this place? This home she has helped me rebuild from ash? You want to give her back to the man who snapped her bones like kindling?" He took another step. "You'll have to come through me." It was then that Elara did something no one expected. She stepped out from behind him, her limp pronounced, a testament to the truth of his words. She looked at her father, her eyes filled not with fear but with a cold, clear finality. She did not speak, she did not have to. Her presence beside Elias was her answer. The crowd faltered. The righteous certainty began to crumble, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable shame. They looked from the broken girl to her cowering father, to the unyielding man who stood ready to defend her. The preacher's words died in his throat. He had no sermon for this. This was a truth too raw and real for his platitudes. One by one, they turned away, the posse dissolving into a scattered retreat of embarrassed individuals, leaving the preacher, the sheriff, and Silas alone in the dust. Silas gave one last, haunted look at his daughter, then turned and shambled away, a man forever broken by his own cruelty. In the aftermath, a profound quiet settled over the ranch, but it was a new kind of quiet. The silence was no longer the sound of absence, but the sound of peace. It was the deep, restorative quiet that follows a fever, the calm that settles after a storm has passed and washed the world clean. The town of redemption left them alone, its judgment silenced by a truth it could not comfortably ignore. Elias and Elara were now an island, but they were not marooned, they were a world unto themselves. The rhythm of their lives found a new, gentle cadence. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The empty chair for his son and the still rocker for his wife remained by the hearth, but they were no longer monuments of pure grief. They were simply part of the story, scars on the heart of the home, reminders that love, once it has existed, can never be truly erased. Elara's limp was a constant, a gentle rhythm in her walk, but her eyes were no longer haunted. A light had returned to them. One evening, as Elias was cleaning a harness by the firelight, she came and sat in the rocking chair, moving it back and forth in a slow, steady motion. It was the first time it had moved in years. She looked at him and offered a small, hesitant smile. He looked up from his work, his own lips curving in a faint, unaccustomed reply. In that silent exchange, a universe of understanding passed between them. A promise made on a dusty road had been kept. A home had been forged not from blood, but from the shared fragments of two broken lives, glued together with quiet compassion and unwavering loyalty. They had taken the shattered pieces of their existence and built something new, something stronger, something whole. What is a family, if not a place to heal? What is a home, if not a promise to stand between someone you love and the cruelty of the world? It is not always born of biology or blessed by a preacher. Sometimes, it is born of necessity, in the desolate quiet of a broken heart that finds another heart to beat beside. If you have ever carried a grief so heavy it reshaped the landscape of your soul, you know the silence of that desolate plain. If you have ever been broken by the hands that were meant to protect you, you know the fear of being left on that dusty road. We are all, in our own way, survivors of something. We all carry scars, visible and invisible, maps of the battles we have fought. But look closer at those scars. They are not just marks of what was lost. They are testaments to the fact that you healed. They are proof that you endured. And if you are lucky, truly lucky, you will find someone who is not afraid of your broken places, someone who will sit with you in the quiet, who will see the strength in your scars, and who will, without a word, offer you their hand and help you build a new home from the ruins. For love, in its purest form, is not about finding someone perfect. It is about finding someone who will stand with you in the dust, and promise to love you forever, not in spite of your fractures, but because of them. It is the promise to make each other whole.